In 1916, Woodrow Wilson was re-elected President of the United States on a pledge to keep America out of Europe's devastating war. The United States was totally unprepared for warfare. When American troops finally did get involved, they suffered terrible casualties.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
This is the forgotten story of the secret deals, government mistakes, and political intolerance of the war to end all wars.
There are only two sides, American or traitor.
This is the secrets of World War I, declassified. France, 1917. The world had never seen carnage on this scale. The First World War. The challenge went out to America. Britain and France desperately needed help against Germany and its allies.
They had been at war since August 1914. What they needed most in 1917 was just simply soldiers. They had taken such huge casualties in their units that they really seriously were running out of people, and what they wanted were infantrymen who could carry rifles, machine gunners. Both the French and the British wanted assistance now.
The Great War was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It was large-scale, mechanized warfare. But in America, the challenge fell on deaf ears. The horrors of war in a distant land were too great.
There was a lot of opposition to the war. In fact, maybe more opposition than we might have thought at one point. Immigrant communities in the northern cities, many people had come to America in part to escape conscription from the European armies.
The problem in 1917 became how to persuade Americans to support the war.
Woodrow Wilson was essential to getting America into the Great War. He had taken a position that America was too proud to fight, that we were going to be neutral, that we would not get involved in this war amongst the European powers.
America stood at a crossroads in 1917. Wilson could either hope for peace or send American soldiers to try and rescue Europe from the devastation of war.
He tried many times to be the peace leader, to broker a peace deal. And nobody wanted to do that because too many people had died. There was going to be a fighting conclusion.
World War I was triggered by a simple murder. In August 1914, a 20-year-old Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Sarajevo. The powers of Europe were drawn into the worst war mankind had seen. The spark that set off this powder keg was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the radical nationalists known as the Black Hand.
It's an unorganized group of young men who assassinate a key political figure and realize that assassination is a tool that can be used like warfare. On the other hand, they never anticipated that their assassination would cause worldwide tumult and chaos.
Austria, Germany, and Turkey sided against Russia, France, Italy, and Great Britain. The war soon became a stalemate on the Western Front, with thousands of British, French, and German soldiers dying in the mud and misery of the trenches.
During the war, it was feared, and it was always in the back of everybody's mind that he could end his life strangling to death at the bottom of the trench.
the European powers sought allies beyond the continent.
At the beginning of the war, President Wilson said that Americans should be neutral in thought as well as in deed. On the other hand, right from the beginning, England in particular was a major trading partner of the United States, always more so than Germany.
For many Americans, World War I introduced the United States as a major player on the world stage. But the declassified record of America's entry and participation in the war tells a tale of infighting, inexperience, and agonizing sacrifice.
The main problem is the American troops weren't ready to enter the trenches. So it's very easy to train soldiers to fire their weapons, wear their uniforms. It's far more difficult to train all the people, all the soldiers in a division to do all the things that they have to do. In terms of training the artillery, training the transportation people, the logisticians to handle the movement of thousands of tons of supplies, that's an enormously difficult operation.
Britain wanted America to join the war on its side. It established a secret operation to manipulate American news coverage of the war.
It gave the British a tremendous advantage. They were able to pretend that they didn't have a propaganda apparatus. In fact, they had probably the biggest propaganda apparatus of any country in the war.
In August 1914, Britain strategically cut many of the communication links in and out of Germany, particularly those going to the United States.
Well, Britain, of course, cut all the cables across the North Sea leading into Germany to cut back on German communications. This was done immediately when the war started. But the transatlantic cables that Britain controlled were always open during the entire war.
This gave Britain a monopoly on war news in America. It established a press bureau that issued updates on the war to hundreds of American newspapers.
They knew exactly what propaganda move worked and what didn't work. And the beauty of it all was that nobody knew they existed.
The propaganda machine churned out stories, mostly false, of German atrocities in Europe, especially in occupied Belgium.
Germans were accused of bayoneting babies, of raping nuns, of doing all sorts of things that later turned out to have been greatly exaggerated.
For the first 3 years of the war, the United States was technically neutral. But American banks were loaning Britain the money to wage war, and American munitions companies were filling unprecedented orders from London.
It was a boom time for U.S. industry because we were producing everything for the Allies: rifles, artillery, munitions, grain, horses, petroleum.
That included poison gas, a new weapon that the United States had not produced before the war.
U.S. manufacturers made some chlorine, which was used for cooling and cooling systems at the time, but the government had to start producing it themselves.